Okay, welcome to the Unit 2 guided lecture for AP Euro. You can see this one's Age of Reformation, 1450 to 1648, same time period as Unit 1, and this is the second of two units in that time period, first time period in AP Euro. So let's get to it. It's called the Age of Reformation, but for the most part, we're just going to be focusing on the Reformation itself. Towards the end, I'll also focus a little bit on European society, culture. There's going to be some politics interwoven in here because, of course, that's a huge part of the Reformation, but we're really going to be talking a lot about religion and the different events of the Protestant Reformation. So if we were to take a look at a religion map of Europe in the early 16th century, we'd see something like this. I mean, this is a terrible map, and that's because you didn't really need a map to see European religions in the early 16th century. There were three. There were Orthodox Christians who are pretty much off the map. They're over here on the right-hand side. You can see them in the Ottoman Empire. There are Muslims. Again, you can see them in the Ottoman Empire, but for the most part, they're off the map. The vast majority of Europe is Catholic. That's the only Christian denomination aside from Eastern Orthodox that has any large number of adherents. And so when we're talking about the cohesion of Europe prior to 1517, Europe was united in its religion. Europeans, we know, had different languages and cultures and states, polities. I mean, they were very, very different, but the one thing that united them all was Catholicism. And that's going to change. It's going to change pretty quickly and pretty radically, starting around 1517. I mean, 1517 is a demarcation point that historians point to when they talk about the start of the Reformation. But as we'll see with all things in history, the roots are much deeper. And so if we were to look at a map of religions in Europe in 1648, which is the time of the Peace of Westphalia and the end of the 30 Years' War, we see a much different picture. Catholicism still dominates in the green, and we can see there are predominantly Catholic countries that are still today predominantly Catholic. We're talking about France, Italy, Spain, Portugal for the most part. But Protestantism and Protestant religions have really taken hold in a number of places across Europe, most notably in Central and Northern Europe, Norway, Sweden, Finland, which is kind of off the map here, Germany, Denmark, of course, and then England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. The split still remains, by the way, in Ireland. We'll talk about that as we go through the course. Ireland, another predominantly Catholic country, though Northern Ireland predominantly Protestant. So the story of this unit and the story of this guided lecture is really explaining these two maps. How do we get from here, this place of relative unity in terms of religious adherence in Europe in 1517 to 130 years later to disunity and the story of what happens in between. Again, this is not the best chart just because I couldn't find one that was high enough resolution, but I do think if you stare at it and squint, you can make out most of the important words here. But when we're talking about the Christian church, we have the early Christian church, and then we have the Roman Catholic Church. And off of the Roman Catholic Church shoots the Eastern Orthodox Church, which still exists today. Greek and Russian Orthodox churches still exist today. That offshoot happens very early, right? That happens with the collapse of the Roman Empire back in the 5th century AD. And so that rift happens 1,000 years before the Protestant Reformation, and these two churches develop along similar but different lines for the next 1,000 years. And then what happens in and around 1517, we can say early 16th century, is we start to see all of these other Protestant religions pop up. Now, the goal for this course is not for you to know each of these religions. In fact, I do not know each of these religions. I've heard of the majority of them, as you probably have, but we don't really need to get into the actual beliefs and philosophies of these different religions. Instead, what we need to understand is this rift. We need to understand this split here, and we need to understand some of these religions in some more detail. The Lutheran religion, for sure, is one that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Presbyterianism. We're also going to talk about the Church of England. We're going to mention the Church of Scotland. We're going to mention the Anabaptists and the Calvinists. But for the most part, the rest of these we don't need to be too concerned about. Some of them will pop up later in the course. Quakers will pop up later in the course. But that's why I put this chart up here, just for you to see. So if we go back to 1517, we have this. The rest of this chart doesn't exist. We just have this branch of the chart. And we have this explosion in the early 16th century of Protestant reformers. Like I said, the roots go deeper than this, and there are some early reformers who we want to know for AP Euro. John Wycliffe, early to mid 14th century, is one of our reformers interested in the authority of the clergy and the idea that people should be able to interpret and read the Bible on their own. This is a big one for a lot of the Protestant reformers. Martin Luther shares this conviction with Wycliffe that that the Bible should not be interpreted to people by priests, which is the way the Catholic Church did it. You, as a layperson, you understood biblical teachings by going to church and by listening to priests. Now, this was problematic for people like Wycliffe and Luther for a couple reasons. One, Mass was given in Latin, so there were a lot of people who just didn't understand it. The second reason was that there are a lot of priests who are they have their own ideas about what should be preached and what shouldn't be, and what should be taught and what shouldn't be. I don't want to say they were untruthful, although there were no doubt some of those priests as well. But Wycliffe and Luther said that the priests were easily corrupted by this power that they held over people. They were basically the transmitters of Christian teachings. They were the go-betweens between God and the people. And a lot of Protestant reformers say, this is a problem. We're leading to a place where abuses can be rife. He lived during the Western Schism, which is a time when there is actually more than one pope. If we look at the history of Catholicism, there are the history of papal authority is one that is riddled with death and battles and conflicts. And the Western Schism is one of those things. It's not really something we need to know too much about for AP Euro because it comes before the course, which starts in 1450. But the Western Schism is one of those things we can point to show that there is conflict in the Catholic Church even prior to the Protestant Reformation. Jan Hus is another one, late 14th, early 15th century. We can see here stylized in this medieval painting of him being burned at the stake. Spoiler alert. He wanted bishops to be elected and not appointed by the Pope. You'll notice one of the commonalities in a lot of these reformers is that they believe in giving the people, the lay people, some more semblance of power or a stake in the church. Jan Hus, like a couple of these reformers, is going to happen to them. He's called in front of a Catholic council, the Council of Constance. He makes his case, he states his case, but the Catholic Church rejects his teachings and burns him at the stake. Prior to this, Jan Hus had been excommunicated from the church, which means that he is banished, not just from the church, but from the religion. Excommunication is a really big deal for people who are religious because it doesn't just mean you can't come to church anymore or don't listen to this guy, he's crazy. It means quite literally you can't get into the kingdom of heaven. So you are doomed for all eternity. Excommunication is a big deal. So he's excommunicated. He's brought in front of the Council of Constance. He states his case. He makes, some would say, a pretty compelling case, but the Catholic clergy who is there, the Catholic officials who are there say, this guy's dangerous. He's a heretic. He's teaching heretical teachings, so he must be killed. This is the punishment for a treasonous heretic, and he is burned at the stake. To show how devout he was, the onlookers reported hearing him singing hymnals as he is burned alive. So he was a believer. Spiritual leader of the Moravian Church, which is another one of those churches that is still around today. And Erasmus, who we have mentioned. I know he came up in your, I think he came up in your reading, but I like this quote. Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. Erasmus is living at the same time as Martin Luther, and Erasmus is one of these great humanist thinkers who is committed to reforming the Catholic Church from within, just like Luther was at the start. And we need to know that about a lot of these reformers. These are not people who set out to destroy the Catholic Church. They set out to reform the Catholic Church. Also held to Catholic doctrines such as that of free will, which we'll see some Protestant reformers reject in favor of predestination. So before we get to Martin Luther, who is the big one, these are the three people who you should really know for contextualizing Martin Luther and more broadly contextualizing the Protestant Reformation. Okay? So that is that. Moving on. So the most important invention of all time, at least my belief, is the printing press, which is invented in Johann Gutenberg in Germany in 1440 around 1450. Movable type had been imported from the Far East, from China, and it's Gutenberg who's going to create a invention that allows for this movable type to create mass-produced pamphlets or books, but pamphlets as well. And you can see how much more efficient the printing press was. Hand printing, a printer could do about 40 pages a day. With the printing press, all of a sudden, we can get 3,600 pages per day out of one single worker. This is a revolutionary instrument and tool. And I do believe that it is the most important invention of all time, which over my teaching career here at Hopewell, students have pushed back against, but I have always defeated them because I am right. It is the most important invention of all time. So why? Well, it makes literature and newspapers and pamphlets, it makes the dissemination of ideas available to the masses. You cannot have the Reformation without the printing press. Indeed, you can't have most of the major events that are going to follow without the education of the masses and without the ability of reformers and revolutionaries to spread their thoughts widely. Prior to the printing press, the way that these types of events would spread is simply by preaching, by giving lectures, by traveling through the places where you wanted to have your voice heard. Well, you think about the amount of people you can reach doing that. It is far smaller than something like the book, especially once the book can be mass produced. So how does it relate to the Reformation? Of course, Martin Luther's teachings are widely disseminated pretty rapidly in the early 16th century, and he gains a lot of followers because of that. And not just Luther, but all of the others who we're going to talk about as well. All of these Protestant reformers are able to utilize the printing press and the now increasing literacy of the masses to spread their teachings. So, what is the Protestant Reformation? I think most of you probably remember this from world history. It's not something we spend a lot of time on in ninth grade, but it is something that is mentioned. It's a religious movement in the 1500s that split the Christian church in Western Europe and led to the establishment of a number of new churches, which, I think you pretty much know. So why does this happen? Well, the Catholic Church, by the time we get to the early 16th century, has a lot of problems, at least as far as the Protestant reformers are concerned. And as we saw, it stretches back far beyond that. The Catholic Church was such a large organization that it created this environment, fertile ground for corruption. And it was also incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy. And so because of that, when we look at the Catholic Church at the time of Luther and the beginning of the 16th century, there were a lot of practices that Luther would say and other reformers would say were not godly. They were not intended to be a part of the Catholic Church. We'll talk about some of these more specifically in a moment and in class. One of the things that we're going to really key in on, which is one of the things that Luther really hated about the Catholic Church, and it was probably the easiest thing for him to attack as immoral and ungodly, was the selling of indulgences. I probably should have bolded this word here, but indulgences. Indulgences were papal pardons. They were pardons for a sin that you committed, and they were supposed to be given to people who professed penance, who said they were sorry and were genuinely apologetic. Well, by the time we get to the early 16th century, there are some who are selling these indulgences, and they are selling these indulgences to make money. And so now there's this situation where people cannot buy their way out of sin. And Luther believes that this is just wrong, that this is not something that the Catholic Church should be engaging in. And so he pens his 95 Theses in 1517. There are 95 problems he has with the Catholic Church, some of them related to each other. So it's not 95 distinct problems with the Catholic Church, but it's a lot. And the selling of indulgences are but one of the problems that Luther points to. But more broadly, you don't need to know all these 95 Theses. Like I said, we'll do an activity in class where we tear into a few of them. We'll probably cover 15 or 20 of them, but you don't need to know all of them. What you do know is that Luther is attacking these things: corruption, abuse of power, and immorality. And he's really keying in on indulgences and the power of the priestly class over lay people. He believes the Bible should be read by individuals, that it shouldn't just be taught by priests, that the Bible should be printed in the vernacular, that preaching should be done in the vernacular so people actually understand the teachings. All of these things are going to work their way into the 95 Theses. So who was Luther? Luther was a monk. He was Catholic. He was a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, which is in Germany. He did not set out to destroy the Catholic Church like all of the other reformers before him. The other reformers that we've talked about, I should say. There were certainly some who sought to destroy the Catholic Church, but the big ones are attempting to reform the church. He wants the church to be better. He believes that criticism of the church is a way to bring light to these abuses and these wrongs. And so he is one of the many leaders of the Protestant Reformation, but he is really considered to be the most influential, I guess you could say. Luther is the one who sparks the fire. These other reformers had come and gone, and they had created, like I had said before, fertile ground for Luther. But it's really Luther that sparks this fire that's going to burn forever, and it's going to create Protestantism. Not his goal, but that is what's going to happen. So yeah, this is related to the selling of indulgences and the corruption, or the perceived corruption, of the Catholic Church. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. This idea that people have that the Catholic Church is economically and financially corrupt, that people are just buying their way out of sin. Prophetically, he, the story is prophetic. Shouldn't say he's a prophet, but there's a prophetic story, a myth perhaps, that he nailed these 95 Theses very dramatically to a church door, the church chapel in Wittenberg, Germany. There's some debate about whether or not he did this, but the significance is that in 1517 he penned these 95 Theses and he began to disseminate them. They were written in Latin, but he is talking about them, and other people are talking about them in the vernacular. And so his goal is to reform the church. He criticized indulgences, the power of the pulp, the wealth of the church, the power of the priestly class could go in there as well. And Luther believes that God's grace should be won and is won by faith alone. That all of these other things that the Catholic Church is asking of people is just wrong. The Catholic view is that good works are significant, and Luther says, good works are important, but when we're talking about God's grace and God's forgiveness, this is faith alone. And the belief in Jesus Christ and reverence to him is enough. And the Catholic view that you have to do things to support the Catholic Church specifically is wrong. Well, as you can imagine, the reaction from the Catholic Church is swift and brutal. Luther represents a threat to the foundations of Catholic power, not just Catholic religious authority, but Catholic political power, because the Pope is not just a religious figure in the early 16th century in Europe. The Pope is one of the most powerful political figures in Europe as well. And here Luther is criticizing this. He is criticizing their wealth, which is where a lot of their authority comes from. He's criticizing the bedrock of Catholic power. And so as his teachings take hold, as he becomes more famous or infamous, if you are in the Catholic Church, it becomes clear to Pope Leo X that something has to be done. And so Luther is excommunicated, just like the reformers before him, like Jan Hus. I already explained that, expelled from the Catholic Church. And the Holy Roman Emperor, who is Charles V at the time, passes measures to suppress Luther's writings. The Holy Roman Empire is this land that is pretty much modern-day Germany. And the Holy Roman Empire, who is, we'll talk about him more next unit, he's more a figurehead than anything. He doesn't have too much real political power over the German states and principalities, but he does have some. And he is passing measures to attempt to suppress Luther's writings, because the epicenter of this Protestant Reformation is going to be Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire. Luther's demands are rejected by the Catholic Church. His reforms are rejected by the Catholic Church. And Lutheran princes in Germany, many of whom saw an opportunity here, issued a protestatio. they're protesting. And this is where we get the word Protestant Reformation from. These Lutheran princes believe that they are, well, I want to say it's questionable how devout they were and how much they actually had issues with the Catholic Church and how much they believed in Luther's religious teachings, because there is the political element here, and these German princes see an opportunity to gain more power for themselves, because if they can manage to break away from the Catholic Church, now all of a sudden that's more power, more authority, and more money for them, because they won't owe it to the Catholic Church. And so when we talk about the Protestant Reformation, we have to talk about the religious and the social and the political all wrapped up together. So other reformers emerged who took this opportunity to voice their concerns. Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland is one of these names who we should know. He believed in a few things that Luther did not, that are worth noting. The right of priests to marry is a big one. And in fact, Zwingli himself marries. He is a priest. He does marry, and he is against the Lenten fast. I'll be honest, I don't know why, but that is one of the things that he is against and known for. He very famously breaks the Lenten fast in public by eating, I think, a sausage or something like that, which is a big deal. I mean, it goes against Catholic teachings. John Calvin, Calvinists also in Switzerland, he believes in predestination, which is the idea that when you are born, you are predestined. You are either chosen by God or you are not. Predestination. The Catholic teachings are that good works are what get you into heaven. John Calvin says no. God knows who will be saved ahead of time, even before people are born, and therefore guides the lives of those predestined to salvation. Now, interestingly, you might say, well, wait a second. If God already knows who's predestined, what does this life matter? I can do whatever I want. I'm either getting into heaven or I'm not. That's not exactly the way the Calvinists view it, because what the Calvinists come to believe is that you can tell the people who are predestined by God because they are the best among us. They are the hardest workers. And so we get the Protestant work ethic out of this. It's directly related to John Calvin's idea of predestination. You can tell the people who are predetermined by God to be saved because they have the Protestant work ethic. John Knox in Scotland, he is laying the grounds for the Presbyterian Church, which is one of the more prominent churches here in America and has its roots in Scotland with John Knox. So if we're talking about Protestant reformers, I think those are the big four that you should know for AP Euro. There are many others, but Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and Knox are going to get you a lot of the way to what you need to know about the Protestant Reformation and a lot of the specifics. Now, when we're talking about the English Reformation, there are also some other people here who you should know, although I'm not quite sure we would call the big one a reformer. I guess he was, although he did it for questionable motives. So King Henry VIII, who's one of the most famous kings of England, here he is here, one of the most powerful and one of the most significant legacies. King Henry VIII is known for a few things. One of the things he is known for is the fact that he had six wives, and you can see they did not meet good ends, many of them. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It's a little morbid rhyme you can remember about King Henry and his wives. The most significant part of the story for us is in AP Euro are the first two of the wives, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Probably the two most famous wives. Jane Seymour is also famous too. King Henry, like all kings of the age, wants a son because the son is the heir to the throne and all of his kingly wealth. But his first wife, Catherine, does not give birth to a son. At the time, this is blamed on the women. We, of course, know now, due to modern genetics, that it is, in fact, the fault of the men, but pay no attention to that. So Henry says, look, Catherine, she gets to the point where she's about 40 years old. He's already had multiple affairs, which is common for kings at the time. He falls in love with Anne Boleyn, and so he's now got two reasons to get a divorce. or an annulment. An annulment is a divorce granted by the Catholic Church that says not only are you divorced, but the marriage never happened. That's an annulment. And so he goes to Pope Clement VII and says, hey, I need an annulment from Catherine. She's not giving me an heir. And, by the way, I want to get married again. And the Pope says, no, we're not going to do this. And so King Henry VIII says, okay, I'll form my own church. And he breaks away from the Catholic Church and creates the Church of England. In the Act of Supremacy of 1534, subjects were required to take an oath declaring him, Henry VIII, to be the supreme head of the Church of England, replacing papal authority over England with the authority of the monarchy. And this is still the way it is today, at least in law. In practice, in England, as you guys probably know, the monarchy are essentially just figureheads. They don't really have any real political power, but Queen Elizabeth is the head of the Church of England today. The royal family is the head of the Church of England today. So this is something that is initiated by Henry VIII to get a divorce from his wife. And this is the creation of the Anglican Church of England. This is called the Episcopal Church in America. The Episcopal Church in America is different than the Anglican Church because the Episcopals don't owe their authority to the monarch, Queen Elizabeth, but the Episcopal Church is very closely related to the Church of England today. This story should help you understand why, if you look at the actual doctrine of Anglican teachings, they're very similar to Catholic teachings. They still have saints, for example. Many Protestant religions do away with the saints. The Anglicans do not. Their teachings are very, very similar to Catholicism, and that's because when Henry VIII creates the Church of England, he really just slices it off. He doesn't have any of these concerns about the teachings of the Church, like the other Protestant reformers, Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, and Luther have. He just wants a divorce, and so just keep the religion as is. But just replace the Pope at the head of it. So when we look at this, we have to look at the ramifications of the Reformation. Of course, in terms of religion, the ramifications are massive. We have all of these new religions that pop up, but this is not a clean process, and I think that should be fairly obvious to you. The Catholic Church is going to do all it can to assert its authority over these now rebellious areas. The Catholic Church views as rebellious areas. And so for the next 130 years, this is going to be a time period of open warfare throughout Europe. Now, a lot of these wars are intermixed with rebellions and revolutions that are not due to religion. Some of these wars and these rebellions are using revolution as a justification. Some of them are more directly about religion. You have a number of situations where Protestants are attempting to cement their faith in the ground where they live by building churches, quite literally in the ground, or just by professing their faith, and the Catholics are persecuting them, maybe Catholic rulers. So you do have situations where these religious wars are Protestants who are fighting for their freedom of worship or who are fighting for their lives against Catholics. But you also have a situation where there are people who are struggling to survive. You have peasant revolts who are saying, yeah, and oh, by the way, you're oppressing us because you're not giving us freedom of worship. So they're sort of using the Protestant Reformation to their ends. So we shouldn't just view these as strictly religious conflicts, but all of these conflicts have now religion as an element to them, which they didn't have prior to 1517, unless we were looking at things like conflicts against the Christian and Islamic world, for example. Now we have these intra-conflicts that are happening in Western Europe, and we can see all of these here. The big ones that we really want to focus on, the German Peasants' War is one of the first to really pop up that is a large-scale conflict. The French Wars of Religion and what's happening to the Huguenots is also significant, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The 30 Years' War is the big one. And the 30 Years' War, we're going to talk more about in Unit 3. The 30 Years' War is one of the largest conflicts. It's going to leave millions of people dead. The 30 Years' War is also significant because it ends in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which in some ways ends the Protestant Reformation. That's a somewhat controversial statement. There are some historians who say, hey, Protestant Reformation is kind of still going on. But when we look at the initial impetus and how it spread, 1648 is a nice, clean point for historians to say a lot of these reforming energies died down. Right? So there is a counter-Reformation that happens within the Catholic Church. It takes a while, but it gets to the point where the Catholic Church says, we have a real problem on our hands, and that problem is not going away. It's only getting worse. And so we need to turn inwards. We need to not just persecute Protestants and try to quash them by violent means or by restrictive means, which, let's be clear, the Catholics are going to continue to do, but we also need to try to convince Protestants to come back to the Catholic Church, and we need to convince Catholics not to leave the Catholic Church. And so we get the Catholic Reformation, also called the Counter-Reformation. The most famous event here is the Council of Trent, which is a series of meetings that occur over basically a 20-year time period, 1545 to 1563. And the Council of Trent is issuing numerous clarifications and statements on Catholic teachings and doctrines. And what the Catholic Church is trying to do here is to standardize the practice of Catholicism around the continent and soon to be around the world, because within this, the New World has been discovered by Europeans, and now there's a race to convert all of these natives. And so the Council of Trent is convened as a way to try to get rid of some of the abuses that Luther and the other reformers were worried about, but also to try to standardize Catholicism so that the experience was the same for practitioners and priests around the world. So competing with the new Protestant branches, spreading Catholicism with this missionary activity to the Far East, to Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, but also, of course, to the New World, to the Americas. As I mentioned, though, we shouldn't just view the Catholic Reformation as this this inward moment where the Catholic clergy and the Catholic hierarchy is saying, oh man, we really screwed up. We need to do some things wrong. Maybe these Protestants have a point. No, it's more about trying to destroy Protestantism from within and without. So the expulsion and forcible conversion of Protestants is still very much a part of the Catholic Reformation. And yeah, as I mentioned, the final phase here is this 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. Which ended with the Peace of Westphalia, which essentially created the modern state system in Europe. But like I said, more on that next unit. We'll take a closer look at that. The big thing that comes out of the Peace of Westphalia is this idea of state sovereignty, that rulers should have the authority to exercise sovereignty within their political borders. Now, rulers are still going to continue to fight over political borders, of course, but religion is in many ways removed as a rationale for that. The Peace of Westphalia says, look, if you in France want to be Catholic, then you can be Catholic. And if you guys in England, you want to be Anglican, Church of England, that's fine. Germany, Protestant, that's fine. That's the way it's going to be, because sovereignty has to be the principal bedrock of the European state system. If it's not, then we're just going to be continuing to fight these wars over legitimacy. If every Protestant believes that every Catholic ruler is not legitimate and vice versa, then these wars will be never ending. And so that's the big deal with the Peace of Westphalia. But like I said, we'll take a closer look at that in Unit 3. So I hope you can see that the legacy of the Reformation and the impact here is massive. When we're talking about the average daily life of a European, a peasant, someone who is of the rising middle class, perhaps, which is a small slice, but it's getting bigger by the time we get to the 1600s due to merchant activities. But mostly I'm talking about the peasants here. Impact on the daily life. New competition for a person's faith. There's probably more preachers who are coming to town. More education. That's also a part of it, although it's going to take a while for the peasants to really feel the effects of that, positive effects of that. The constant warfare is that's ever present for peasants across Europe. That's a big, big part of the legacy of the Reformation. There are people who are just being born, living their lives, and dying, just never knowing peace. We shouldn't forget that about the Reformation. The Protestant work ethic, which I already mentioned, and proto-capitalism, which is going to link to capitalism. Hard work means that you are one of the saved. And so you want to show all of your neighbors that, hey, I'm predestined for greatness. And so you're going to work your tail off. Higher literacy and schooling rates across Europe are a part of that too. Because, it goes back to the printing press, right? This is what reformers are attempting to use to spread their beliefs. And if you want to spread your beliefs, you need people who are literate. And how do you get people who are literate? Well, you fund schools. So that's it's going to take a while. I don't want you to feel like you walk into Europe in 1649 and it's like, wow, everybody's going to school. I mean, public education is like a 19th century thing, but it's starting the ball rolling down the hill. I already mentioned this, the Peace of Westphalia, so I won't belabor that point. The separation of church and state, also, we can trace its lineage really back to the Reformation. Martin Luther has this conception which he calls the two kingdoms, the church and the state. We should not believe that the separation of church and state is this 16th century idea. It's going to take a lot longer, and indeed there are many states today that they do not have this, but we're talking about roots here, and the Reformation is a big part of that. Okay. All right, so that's all I got. Hope you learned something. If you have questions, feel free to let me know in class.